Hmong-ish is a podcast produced by Hmong American Media located in Sacramento, California, and sponsored by Hmong Organizing for Progress and Empowerment Center, which is the Hope Center, along with Culture Through Cloth. I am your host, Shoun.
And I'm your host, Pachia. And we are Hmong-ish.
Hmong-ish is a podcast where Pachia and I share our thoughts on anything and all things Hmong, diving into our own experiences and what it means to be Hmong American and Hmong in today's time.
Today we are going to be talking about the Hmong refugee story. So here in the U.S., we, the Hmong community, are primarily known to the larger community as being a community of refugees. The Hmong refugee story is what, people really understand us as, or as us coming from. So we're going to be diving more into what this means, what this is, on a personal level, talking about what is a refugee, a little bit more about the history of why we are refugees to the U.S., and then a little dive also into what refugee resettlement was like when we first came to the U.S. in the 80s, or the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and also today with, newer refugee populations that are coming to the U.S. Refugees are considered people who have fled war, violence, conflict, or persecution and have crossed an international border to find safety in another country. So we might hear that word being used a lot, there are refugees that are leaving this country to this country. Refugees are people who are immigrating or leaving their country to basically seek safety in another country because of some type of persecution or conflict or war, whether it's racial persecution, religious persecution, any type of conflict that's happening in their country that makes it unsafe for them to stay there. If countries are accepting you, then you can apply to immigrate to other countries as a refugee because you are trying to seek safety. So that's what the UNHCR is there for, and that's why we're considered refugees to the U.S. because at the end of the Vietnam War, which pretty much was connected to the secret war that the U.S. was having in Laos, a lot of the Hmong folks that helped the American CIA and the American military in Southeast Asia then were leaving the country because they were fleeing any possible persecution. That's why we're refugees, and we left Laos to go to Thailand to live in refugee camps and then to come to the U.S.
So what is the secret war? Just a little background information on what the secret war is and why is it called a secret war, right? The secret war was a war that took place in Laos from 1962 to 1975. During the Vietnam War, there was a trail that supplied the North Vietnamese to the troops in the South called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Mm-hmm. And through this trail, the North Vietnamese would push supplies down through towards South Vietnam border. Around the 1960s Geneva Accord, Laos was declared a neutral country, right? And no foreign troops were supposed to be there. Well, the North Vietnamese were violating that and then the Americans needed to recruit or need boots on the ground. Well, they can't violate that Neutrality Act. And so they looked for people in Laos who could, fight on behalf of the Americans. And the CIA started the first covert operation where they recruited, the Hmong to fight for them. And they actually recruited a prominent officer in the Lao army named General Vinh Pao. Mm-hmm. And under General Vinh Pao, he trained and established bases in northern Laos, and he helped infiltrate the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He helped rescue the American pilots. He protected American interests. Mm-hmm. So basically, sometimes people say we were a mercenary army for the CIA, and that's kind of true, but we were also American troops on the ground. Even though we were American citizens, we fought on behalf of America. And so that is why it's called a secret war, because we were an army that was hired or trained by the CIA to fight in the Vietnam War, but it was in Laos.
And you said this was the first U.S. CIA covert operation.
Yes, so this was the first time, I guess, the CIA actually went into a country and covertly recruited people to fight a war
I see.
on behalf of the United States. We see that in the 80s in Afghanistan, where Afghans were trained to fight against the Soviet invasion. Thus, we kind of have Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
In Syria, we've done that twice in Syria with the Kurds. The Kurds is kind of like our experience, where they're a minority in Syria. They're promised certain things by foreign nations, and they fought on behalf of foreign nations, and then they get left behind.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
I think for the Hmong people, we became refugees because we were promised that, hey, even America's not going to lose this war, and when America loses war, we'll take care of you. And that's kind of like the unwritten promise to the Hmong people, Thus, 1975 rolls around, America withdraw from Vietnam, and the Hmong people are left to fend for themselves. And then, thank God we have people in the CIA like Bill Lair and other folks who Jerry Daniels, who advocated for Hmong people to come to the United States.
Sure.
And evacuate. But then you see, this is kind of like, okay, why is the war called a secret war then? If, we're here and in the United States, if it was a secret war, then they wouldn't know about us. But then it took a lot of advocacy from folks in the public and policy works to get us recognized and to come here. And thus, that's why this war was called a secret war. In 1975, Congress passed the Refugee Act of 1975. It only stated that, Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees were able to get assistance to come to the United States.
Oh, I see.
So it excluded Laos and other Southeast Asian nations or nationalities as well. And from 1975 to 1980, the only folks who were directly involved in the CIA Army or directly served under Jing Pao were able to come to the United States. And that's when 1980, where there was advocacy and more talk about reforming immigration policy, the Congress passed 1980 Refugee Act, which allowed it was a more wholesome policy, where it allowed people from Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, other ethnic minorities to come, and that's when we saw the first influx of Hmong refugees coming in large numbers to the United States. That started in 1980. So from 75 to 1980, there was always who are these people in Thailand in the refugee camps and what's their story? And thus, I think because of this two policy and Congress finally understanding what the CIA did, that's why our experience is called the secret war in Laos, because it's a secret because policymakers in the United States did not know what was going on, did not know who the Hmong people were or who we served. And that's why I believe it's a secret war in Laos. That's why it's called secret war.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah. And so, hence 1980 refugees, Hmong people comes to the United States in drove, and then there was 3 waves of Hmong refugees we could classify. First, we could call the first wave is the 1980s wave. And then there's the 1990s wave, which is the closure of the camps, and the majority of them came over. And then there's the mid-2000 waves called the Mong Kachua, or the Watakabok phase. And why were there this phase? Because, not everything is just, we're refugees, we're going to go to America and leave. A lot of Hmong refugees went to the camps and they held on.
They stayed there and they didn't want to come.
Yeah, they didn't want to come because they believed that they could eventually go back to Laos. And so when V9 closed in 1992, I believe, or in the early 90s, don't quote me, a lot of Hmong people wanted to stay and they didn't want to come. So a lot of them were forced to come to the United States, and that's the second wave. And then a lot of them who stayed behind, they went to Wat Takambal. Wat Takambal is actually a Buddhist temple.
Yeah.
And Awat.
Luwa.
And Luwa. And people in Wat Takambal, they go there to Mutuyengna. So
see.
a lot of people go to what I talk about to go cure themselves of their opiate addiction. There's a woman there, she's a Buddhist. Thailand's very religious, so she created this thing where like, oh, all these people are opiate addicts and they could come stay at the Wat. And so all the Hmong people who didn't want to come to the United States.
So she kind of used it as a means to allow people to come in if they were to say, oh yeah, I'm coming there for that. Even if maybe they weren't.
They weren't, And so that's why we have such a huge population who stayed behind in Watakama.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about that, but I do know many people respected her because she did a lot to help the Hmong people.
And her son, too. So it's Nielongpo and Longpo, right? And then they both, and you know, what actually forced what I talk about to close down was after he passed away. That kind of like what broke the camel's back to say, hey, either you guys get repatriated back to Laos or you go to the States. And that's when the very last wave of refugees came to the United States is in the early 2000s.
I remember that because I was a young kid.
In high school, we created this tutoring program, and I was a freshman, but I took charge of it, and I was like the coordinator for 4 years, and we tutored Hmong refugees from Watakama. Nice. So that's why I learned about their stories, I learned about their background. It was so interesting.
I remember that I interviewed to be a part of that, but I couldn't speak Hmong, so I wasn't hired.
Really?
Yeah, they gave me a nutritional triangle, like a printout, and they're like, "How would you explain this to someone?" And I was like, I don't know how to explain it. Chẳng cái sao nói, chẳng cái toan sao nó, But yeah, that was me. Okay, I didn't really know how to speak Hmong back in high school and stuff. So, but that's really great. Yeah. So I kind of remember that you guys had programs like that, and when we became friends and I learned that you did that, I thought that was really nice. What wave of refugees were your parents? Like, are you a refugee first off?
I am a child of refugees.
Same.
So I am okay. So Pachia and I were both
children of
refugees. My parents were considered the first wave of refugees that came in 1980.
Okay.
And they actually weren't married when they came here. They actually met here. And
where did they meet?
They met in Santa Rosa. And so they married in 1982.
That's kind of like surprisingly a popular place where a lot of Hmong people resettled in Santa Rosa.
Yes. My dad came to San Francisco, and my mom came with her family to Iowa. And somehow my mom and them decided to move to Santa Rosa because there was family there. And so they moved to Santa Rosa. And I think the story was within like 2 months of them being in Santa Rosa, somehow my dad made his way up there to visit relatives or friends, and they met and they got married.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was really fast then.
It was real fast.
So my parents came when they were both very young. They were a part of sort of this first moving into the second wave. Like my dad's family came in 79, and then I think my mom's family came in the early 80s. Okay. But my dad and them, they went to New York, and they were in Buffalo, New York for a while. And then my mom's family also went to Iowa. Sometime in the early mid-80s, you know, everyone was kind of making this mass migration to California, and like people wanted to be together. And so from my dad's family, my grandpa brought them to Portland, and then they came down to Stockton or Sacramento, and my parents met in Stockton. But my parents were both really young, so they came here when they were 5.
Wow, babies.
So they basically grew up here. I feel sometimes almost twice removed from our refugee history and stories.
I think similar here because you know we're children of refugees, so we never experienced the camp. I only learned from secondhand experience. You know, my parents, my aunts and uncles, talking to refugee kids from Watakama and learning about their experiences and just piecing everything together. Then going to school, majoring in history and studying history, Hmong history, American history, policy. And, you know, I think one of the things is going back to the 1980 Refugee Act, right? Why did we end up not coming into one place. Why didn't we could see that the 1980 Refugee Act allowed us to come to the United States.
We were spread out all over.
But we were spread out all over, and that was done
on purpose
because they wanted us to assimilate
right.
into American culture as fast as we can, and it had the opposite effect. What it did was it was underfunded. It was not prepared for. It was not crafted in a ways that it would be supportive of the community,
of the people and the families and individuals.
Yeah. And so what happened was everybody migrated, mass exodus after they've settled down in the states they were in. So all of my mom and their clan, the Lee clan, even if they were in like Kansas or they were in Iowa, they all came to California, Santa Rosa, and then they ended up in Sacramento. My dad, my dad came alone, so he, his family, most of them were in Merced, and then we came to Marysville and Sacramento. But then what happened, in policy wise, is that then. The school districts, the people weren't prepared, and when all the Hmong people congregated together, the school system weren't prepared to, have ESL classes or funding to help support our resettlement. And that's why it led to a lot of us being thrown into like low-income housing and not being adequately supported in schools and all that. And I think America has learned from our refugee experience. We look at the recent latest waves of refugees now, like in Sacramento, the Afghan refugees, right? We don't adopt a policy where we spread them all over the place. Now everybody comes to Sacramento. If you don't know, Sacramento is called Little Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan.
Yes. Because if you are approved to come to the United States as a refugee, most likely you're going to be settled in Sacramento, California, because
there's just such a large Afghani community here in Sacramento.
And so I think policymakers are understanding that, hey, you want this community to thrive, you put them in a community where they're all together, where they could, empower each other, support each other, and thrive.
Where they can build community,
communities, essentially. And that did what happened to us. I think.
Because, we experienced a lot of hardships when we came. We were isolated, living by ourselves. Depending a lot on, say, like host families, looking for support.
My mom recently, right? It was just in her neighborhood, and my mom was coming home, and she saw like these Afghan refugees just scavenging the illegal dumping on the street.
Yeah.
And my mom's like, "Oh, who are these people?" And then my mom's like, "Stop." My mom stopped. My mom's like, "What are you guys doing?" And they're like, "They're gonna take that bed." And my mom's like, "No, that bed is so dirty. Don't take it. Don't take it."
Yeah.
And so she's like, "I have a bed for you. Come to my house."
Sure.
And so my mom put them in her car and she drove them to our house.
That's sweet.
And then she went and she gave one of the extra beds we have was really good. And then she was like, "Wait, I have more stuff to give them." So my mom
really
took
nice.
them to our shed, and so my mom gave them plates, glassware, and all that.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And then my mom asked my dad to help take them or, transfer the supplies to their home. And they just, and when they arrived there, my mom just said it was an apartment complex of like 60 units.
Yeah.
And my mom said it just reminded her of the Hmong experience or her experience when we all lived in the apartments playing marbles, running around.
Right.
There was just kids running around, riding bikes barefooted. And then you could see like all the parents coming out on balconies just to stare down what's going on, what's all this commotion.
And it takes you back.
And it takes you back. And it took her back. And so she was like, "Okay, I'm going to start collecting clothes. I'm going to start collecting bikes and all that." So for the past couple weeks, she's been doing that. And then she realized, wait, I'm doing too much. But the funny story is that we visited the home of the lady who she gave the bed to.
Yeah.
And my mom's like, "What? They did this with the bed." It's so funny.
What did they do?
My mom thought they was going to use the mattress as a bed, but they didn't.
Oh, what did they do?
They actually cut the mattress and sewed it.
Into a couch?
Into a couch.
Wow. Yeah. How nifty.
Yeah.
But because, like couches in the Middle East are like floor couches.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't sell floor couches here in the U.S. Yeah, so it's a cultural thing. They like to sit on the ground.
Yeah, and
honestly, now I'm like, wait, are all those couches I saw beds? That's pretty like ingenious.
Yeah, right. It could be, and I was like, wow. Okay, so you learned so much from just visiting them, being open, just helping.
But you know that scene that you just described of the apartment complex? It reminds me a lot of this painting done by Boon Ma Yang, the artist Boon Ma Yang. Yes. He's a wonderful artist who paints like Hmong life and like Hmong spirituality and stuff. And he has this beautiful painting that actually showed at the Hmong Story 40 exhibition of like Hmong folks growing up in an apartment complex.
I think I have that in Hope Center right there.
Oh, you do? Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. I mean, that's how I remember part of my childhood too, because I would visit my grandparents and they lived in apartments like that. My aunt lived in an apartment like that for a while. So in the summers, you know, you'd visit them. And there's, you know, and then my parents talk about, my mom, for example, talks about growing up in Farmington. I don't know. That seems to be like this huge community that everyone grew up in Stockton. And that's kind of what it was like as refugees in the U.S. living in these sort of crowded but communal apartment complexes. I am a child of refugees. I'm not a refugee myself, like we've said, but I learned so much from working in refugee resettlement. Like, for example, one of the first families I helped to resettle. So I actually worked with a lot of SIV immigrants or special immigrant visa refugees. And so these are the people who maybe worked very closely in the U.S. military. They were engineers, sometimes doctors, and they were, you know, working on base or just working really closely with the American military to some degree. And so it's kind of similar to a lot of the Hmong that were a part of the CIA, where they get this, now it's called an SIV, a special immigrant visa. But because I work primarily with this group and because this group gets relocated here in the Sacramento region more commonly from Afghanistan, then I feel like they're a little bit more privileged per se because they're doctors, they're engineers. But the first family I resettled, they were straight up like from an Afghani village, and they had like 8 children, maybe more. And you could just tell they didn't speak any English. They'd never gone to school or anything like that. And we took them to their apartment, and they were just completely like, we picked them up from the airport, took them to their apartment, and they were just completely just fell out of water. You could just tell. And the mom, you know, she needed to use the bathroom. And so she was kind of like, they like kind of trying to tell me what she needed with her hands. And, you know, I showed her the bathroom, and then she was really confused. She was just like, how do I wash my hands? She was like trying to turn on the shower and stuff. And I was like, no. And I just turned on the sink, and her eyes just really, you know, lit up like, whoa. And it was just very shocking to me as a young woman. I was 22, 23, completely privileged, like don't understand how the world works. But it was very crazy that, you know, I didn't realize like people don't have access to bathrooms like this. They've never seen a faucet before. And then it actually reminded me of, you know, one of my grandmas who told me that when they first came to the U.S., they had no idea how to use a bathroom. They were drinking water out of the toilet because they thought it was a well. And it's sort of these tiny like experiences and things that I picked up that really made me realize, wow, this is exactly what my grandparents went through. Like, this is exactly the same thing, just repeating itself. And here's this whole new group of people coming from small villages in Afghanistan here, and they have this whole new world that they need to learn how to operate in, not just language, but like going to school, paying your bills, counting money. Like, they don't drive. They have to walk on these huge roads. You don't know how many accidents have happened, people who've been hit on bikes that like were refugee families or like individuals who are refugees. So, you know, just like throughout this time that I worked in refugee resettlement, I just saw so much of that. I think it's interesting, like some things we don't understand here is the real fear there is maybe coming as refugees from a place where there's war, there's a lot of stuff happening, like you don't know who to trust, you don't know, if you're going to be safe at night. There was a lot of fear that I saw growing up. I would get this question a lot, like, you guys came here to the US, so why don't you want to assimilate? Or why do you want to keep your culture? Like, why don't you just become American? Like, I'm an immigrant. My family's an immigrant. I don't know.
Right.
And it's like, I don't know. I always kind of
I think it's different for Hmong people, like because we don't have a country, and everywhere we lived, we felt like an outsider.
Well,
And
I
so
feel like
even-
we've always been refugees.
Yeah.
We've
and
always been refugees.
like we call Laos the homeland, but we're actually refugees in Laos.
We are,
Vietnam, we're
yeah.
refugees. And China, we're people of the frontiers,
Right.
and on the outlier. And so
We've always been migrating to
yeah.
leave persecution and violence and war.
Yeah.
So
It's not that we left our own accord. It's not that we're nomadic.
right,
We actually left because we were pushed out.
yeah,
Yeah. And so I think that longing really ties us to like, okay, this is why we're so prideful being Hmong people.
Yeah.
And we want to hold on to culture. We want to hold on to community. And it's just different. I think, if you're an immigrant and you came to the States because, you love American ideals, and we do too. Like Hmong Americans nowadays, we are embracing our American identity and we love it. We love the freedom we enjoy, but then we just have this longing as well, saying, okay, we can't let go of the Hmong culture, because if we do, that's it. Language, if we do, that's it. Like, it's gone.
I think that's a strong part of who we are
Yeah.
as a people,
Yeah.
is we remember who we are
Yes.
and where we've come from.
Yes. So, when did you realize you were a refugee?
I think of that question a lot, and I don't know. I don't know if I learned it in school, and then everything started making sense at one point in my life. I don't know if I learned it from like my grandparents or parents. Like, I can't remember anymore. Can you remember?
I think I learned that I was a refugee. It's only because it was from my older sister. She went to college.
And she came back and told.
And she came back and she told me. She's like, "Look, you're a refugee. Oh, you're writing a paper on your culture? Well, write about the secret war in Laos and learn about." And then you're like, okay, you start looking things up, and you're like, oh wow, we're persecuted. There's a genocide going on.
Yeah.
I grew up thinking there was a genocide in Laos, and we're really, really persecuted. And so that's what I wrote about, and that's when I learned about that we were really refugees, and it lit a fire in me to be really passionate about my community.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But then as you understand more, and as you look into the story more, then you're just like, okay, it's more complex than us being persecuted or there's a genocide in Laos, because that's quite a term to think. We're being genocide in Laos, but like in one of our podcasts, we were like, oh, the vice president of Laos is Hmong.
Yeah, there are nuances.
Yeah.
And,
but then I think that's when I learned I was a refugee, and that our stories were different, and this is why my parents or my community refused to integrate or assimilate into American society. And then you start learning that why is there cultural politics and cultural politics of the homeland, where you have these old men who thinks about nostalgia all the time, right? Think about going back to the homeland so I could be the leader that I was, or uphold my family's name and be like, oh, I am from Tosing this, or Jamun this family, or my dad was Putong, or my dad was a lieutenant colonel, and all that. And then you realize like, oh, okay, this is what it means to be a refugee. You can't let go of homeland politics. And that's how I see it. And then you understand and navigate the community, talk to your elders, but I believe, in the US now, there's a shift, because this type of attitude, this type of homeland politics, it's fading away with the older generation.
Sure.
And younger generations like us, we're redefining what it is to be Hmong Americans.
Right. I actually received a grant from the Refugee Studies Collective with the UC system. And, you know, there's a big push in refugee studies, at least, to move beyond the numbers, because the greater public for a long time didn't really understand the human stories within refugee resettlement. Or it's not that they didn't understand, but they prioritized numbers and statistics about these people who are experiencing these horrendous things, and that's forcing them to come here. And, you know, I also think there's this longing and search to understand, you know, history through this perspective of stories, more like people's individual stories. I know you were sharing stories of people and like their refugee experiences and coming to the U.S. and surviving the war. Like all of these are part of what it means to be a refugee. And we say this is the Hmong refugee story, but at the same time, there's a big like need to remember and better document, understand this, but also not be tied down to it.
Yeah.
And maybe, you know, be able to move beyond it to continue building the community, not just around these stories that do define who we are and where we come from and why we're here. But, you know, also being able to grow from that. It's interesting though, because, you know, the hardest stories to learn about sometimes are your own family stories.
Right.
It's easy to maybe say, I'm going to document stories and then go and like reach out to people you've heard about and document their stories. But the hardest stories to learn about your own family stories. And maybe that's something we should encourage each other to do.
Right.
Just to know your own story.
Just ask your parents.
Yeah.
Like for me, I learned so much by just asking my parents. And then I learned so much about the Hmong community too. Because for example, my mom and them, they were from Nong Pambang and St. Yambari. So they didn't cross the river. Like their narrative is that, oh, we didn't cross the Mekong.
Not all like Hmong refugees crossed the Mekong.
We just walked across the river and walked across the border. And then they weren't in V9. So they were in Hmong V9. They were in Song Toa.
Yeah, I mean, there were like
multiple
dozens of camps too.
And then when I asked my father's side, he was like, oh yeah, be a Hmong Sing, Hmong Ping.
Yeah.
And then my father said, oh yeah, we had to walk 30 days to the border.
Crazy.
And then we have to make makeshift bamboo rafts or tie it to our arms and swim across the river. And then most of us were cheated. We lost our money. And then we weren't allowed to cross into the Thai border until like the very next day. It was really hard on us. And then we ended up in Vinai. And then, you know, and I was like, okay.
This sort of like you just telling me this reminds me of like me hearing conversations from elders about how they came here or like where they're from, and it almost feels like we to some degree need to learn about where we come from so that we can continue to have these sorts of remembrance of like who we are and where we came from.
And these intimate details. I think we just need to listen, like storytelling, right? We just need to document these storytellings, these intimate details of our elders and their traumatic experience as refugees. You know, we weren't boat people. We were boat people because we used boat to cross the room, but we weren't like the Vietnamese experience. So we need to really just document our stories and share it with the public. Even in academia, you know, there's not that many content on the Hmong refugee stories, and a lot of times our stories are interpreted for other means, and so we don't have that human value or human experience to the Hmong refugee experience. It was just talk in numbers, you know, and we you know, as a Hmong community, I think it's about time we start looking at like, okay, what is our story? You know, what is our human connection? How does this refugee experience really make us feel? How did it make our parents feel? And
how would you know if you don't know?
Yeah,
I mean, I think a lot of people don't know, like just 1-2 generation ago, how their parents got here, and it's not an easy conversation to have because it is traumatic.
It's not. It's very traumatic, and that's the whole thing. We don't even understand that it's traumatic. Like our parents don't even understand it's traumatic.
Yeah, I think it's good to know.
Yeah,
it's good to know. You can decide what you want to do with it, but it's good for you to at least know.
Yeah. So, I think this wrap up our podcast today on our refugee experience or our refugee stories. But a question we would like to ask our viewers is, when did you realize you were a refugee? You know?
And what is your family's refugee story? Maybe you already know and you can share that with us.
Feel free to comment on our Facebook, follow us, and like us. And thank you for joining us on today's podcast.
We'll see you all next time.